Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin. Eclectic album reviews and general musical meanderings. I got another roundup post for you this time around, and this is another one in the series of posts that I've been doing that represent my desire to expose myself to a broader variety of black music. So it's all black artists this time around. Some of them are newer artists that I just got exposed to very recently that are current. But I also took this opportunity this time around to get exposed to some more classic black albums that I've just never had a chance to get at. I've thought about for a while and have never really taken the dive and checked out. So this first one, Funkadelic's Maggot Brain, kind of falls into that category. This is a 1971 album, the third album from Funkadelic. And we all know that Funkadelic actually became associated with Parliament Funkadelic, headed up by George Clinton. And this is a very early iteration of those groups. My conception of George Clinton's music is really strongly informed by the sort of very popular mid-70s phase of Parliament Funkadelic. We Got the Funk and that sort of thing, and also particularly the way that music was sampled and used very heavily later on in hip-hop and rap music, especially in the 90s. You know, Dr. Dre's Chronic has a lot of callbacks to that sound. I have virtually no background on Parliament and Funkadelic at all beyond those initial kind of impressions of their work. I don't know the timeline. I don't know much about them. So imagine my surprise whenever I got into Maggot Brain and was exposed to a 10-minute raging guitar solo with all sorts of crazy effects and stuff on it. That was not what I expected to happen at all. But knowing what I do know about the personnel from this era of George Clinton's career of these bands, it really shouldn't have surprised me too much. Instead of getting the sort of upbeat party music that I expected to hear, I got sort of like a bizarre surrealism, like Frank Zappa with half the chops and 3 times the hallucinogens. Quite a bit further over on the rock side of the spectrum, in my opinion, than what I would think of as funk music later on in the 70s, which is what Parliament Funkadelic came to be known for. So at first I didn't quite know what to make of the album clearly, but there's quite a bit going on with the album. It's very got quite a bit of vision to it. There's a lot of history with the album, a lot of critical acclaim that's gone along with it, a lot of which is pretty well deserved after I've had a chance to sit down and sit with it and change my mind about what I was going to be listening to. So rather than really considering this an early funk album, I almost hear it like an extension of what Jimi Hendrix was doing. And I feel like, in my mind at least, I've never given enough credit to George Clinton, and particularly Funkadelic, for kind of being black rock pioneers. You know, Living Colour got a lot of credit for that in the late 80s, but black rock has been around for quite a while. And I think you can trace some of its roots back to this album and this era of Funkadelic's work. So definitely an album I'm going to be examining more as I go along. Okay, next up is Heroes Are Gang Leaders. Their album called the Amiri Baraki Sessions. Now, this is another album that I got sort of just on a search for experimental black music. And they consider themselves to be a literary jazz group. And I take that to mean that they're basically like a jazz band, a jazz group, with spoken word, a big, strong spoken word component. And there's nothing that really sums it up better than that. That's what their group is. And my understanding is that the Amiri Baraki Sessions is one of their first albums. And I really, really do appreciate their vision and what they're trying to do with the album. I think it's a really great concept. I don't know if I really can get behind the execution on this album as far as that goes. It seems very, it's got a lot of great ideas. It's got a lot of great music in it. It's got some great, some really good spoken word sections to it, but it seems a bit unfocused. It seems like they kind of came in, and a lot of it was kind of done very spontaneously with a lot of improvisation, which is a component of jazz. So that's there. There's a reason for it. But the album is a little bit feels like on the overlong side due to it sort of seeming like it's kind of unfocused. Again, it's got some great moments to it. Some good jazz playing in it. Some very impassioned vocal performances, some of which kind of get a little bit too hysterical at times, which kind of takes me out of it to a degree. But the messages on the album are important. And I think that Heroes of Gang Leaders might be a group that I give a little bit more attention to. If I look a little bit further down in their catalog, they have about 3 or 4 other albums that came out after this one. I think maybe an album or 2 down the road might be worth checking out from Heroes or Gang Leaders, because I think that with a little bit more focus, they could make a pretty impactful album. Overall, this one's a good listen, and I do enjoy listening to it. It may not come off the shelf very much after this first initial listen, but I do appreciate the concept behind what they're trying to do. Okay, next up is Moses Sumney's Gray, and this is a really interesting album that kind of falls between several cracks of what you would think of stylistically. It's I would almost call it like a psychedelic soul album. The album's got really ambitious production. It's very vast. It's got a very broad scope to it, and lots of sounds that kind of just blend into one another very, very seamlessly. From a sound standpoint, Gray is quite a feat, I think. And Moses Sumney's performances on the album within that environment are also equally impressive. He's a great vocalist, an amazing singer with lots and lots of range. Sometimes maybe gets a little bit too florid with his singing, so it gets a little bit difficult to pin down like the exact melody.
You've got the wrong guy. You wanna slip right in and put the masculine. You've got the wrong dear son, dear son, if you go prisons.
The other thing is this is conceived of as a double album, even though for me it's a single CD. I believe probably on record it comes as 2 separate records. And it's a pretty long listen, so there's quite a bit going on with the album, and it takes quite a bit of focus to listen to the whole thing. You can also hear how the double album is sort of set up. The first album is the one that's very atmospheric and very textured. The second half of the album is a little bit more intimate than the first half. Okay, next up is the Koreatown Oddities, Little Dominique's Nosebleed. This is a hip-hop album from a guy that kind of just came up on my Bandcamp feed, and I was very drawn into the concept of the album. It's a very autobiographical work where the Koreatown Oddity talks a little bit about his childhood and how he was in these 2 car accidents that really affected him, as you see the album cover describes that. One of which gave him a chronic nosebleed problem, and another one broke his leg, and these things led him on these various paths.
Said you can't wear any your thing, a education on colors, if you know what I mean. A little black man is all people gon' see, so watch out for everybody, not just the police. When you black in LA, hey, that's the routine. It's a shame every day hearing about some shootings. Dominique, do your thing, you a young black king. Keep believing in your dreams, cause your path is unique.
And I love the concept for the album. I really love the autobiographical nature of it, and there's several really great moments on the album. But I also think that the album is plagued a little bit by some filler. Although the lyrics in the album tell the story pretty effectively, it also relies quite a bit on sort of these recorded spoken dialogues, which isn't unusual for a hip hop album. And they're usually, when they're used correctly, I think they can enhance a story. But I feel like a lot of the times on this album, those are used to tell the story rather than the actual lyrics to the album. And it almost feels like there's some shortcuts happening there due to that. I do also, however, appreciate his sense of humor on the album. There's quite a bit of humorous sections in the album. And so he can get away with some things in there due to the personality and to the identity that he's creating and putting forth on the album. But there's also a section on there towards the end where he kind of bursts into song. He's kind of sings a little bit. And I'm always a little bit iffy when rappers sing. It doesn't always go off the way I think that they plan. And in this case, I think he relies on a little bit too much. It doesn't quite sell for me either. So there's quite a bit that I think is respectable about this album, particularly in its concept and in the parts of it where his performances are solid and the storytelling is lyrically very clear. I think there's a lot that is to be appreciated for the album. There's also some sections in here that kind of aren't to my taste. And I'll tell you that I'm a little bit picky about the hip hop and rap that I listen to. So if you're a person who has maybe a broader taste in hip hop than I do, you might really like this album. But for me, this is one I like listening to it. I enjoy it, but it may not, again, come off the shelf too much after this initial listen. We'll see. I'll come back around to it later. We'll see. Okay, next up is MonoNeon's Living My Best Life and My Worst Life at the Same Damn Time. This guy has been a great, great find. MonoNeon is a musician, bass player, and apparently he was one of the last bass players to play with Prince. And if you know that about him, you can definitely see where he's getting some of his influence from. He plays a real kind of funky style, kind of quirky. His albums are very DIY in their approach. You can tell he's kind of doing a lot of it just kind of at home studios and stuff. And his album covers clearly are not super hi-fi, but it all becomes part of the allure of what he's doing. And,
I got some raggedy shit, but my heart is amazing. I'm a raggedy bitch.
I'm a raggedy bitch, yeah.
I got some raggedy shit.
I got some raggedy shit, yeah.
he dresses very garishly, and he's got a very interesting YouTube channel in which he goes through and sort of listens to people's speech and tracks along with it and makes grooves out of people's speeches on bass. Is pretty impressive, actually. He's a right-handed bass player who's taken a right-handed bass and flipped it. So he's actually playing upside down and backwards and with his opposite hand strong. And the style that he's playing in is a real kind of funky slap and pop style. And the fact that he has those strings set up that way actually opens up an entirely different possibility of potential for slap and pop style bass that you wouldn't have on the other side if you're playing it correctly, like standard way. That's very interesting, and it's obviously a clear choice that he took as a right-handed guy to try to take the bass and play it upside down and backwards. But performance-wise, his playing is top-notch. It's great. His songs are super quirky and super fun, very off-color for the most part, in a very Prince-like way. Songs about, again, masturbation and things like that. But it's all kind of done with a wry grin and tongue-in-cheek and good fun. It's kind of like I discovered Primus and Fishbone all at the same time, with a little bit of Bootsy Collins thrown in there just to represent that funky bass that MonoNeon's playing with. This is an artist I really want to look a lot further into. He's got quite a few albums out. They're all, from what I've seen, seem to be pretty consistent. So he's going to be one that I follow for a while, I think. Very curious about other aspects of MonoNeon's playing. Okay, finally, Marvin Gaye's What's Going On. Now, this is a super duper classic album that I've never really listened to its entirety. And, I've never been the target audience for it, to be fair. I was in junior high. I remember when Marvin Gaye died. It was like 1984. And at that time, he was the guy who had done Sexual Healing as far as I was concerned. And that song didn't really make sense to me as a kid in 7th grade. I didn't get it. Didn't really make sense to me. So I've never really pursued, then I went on my whole Tears for Fears and Rush path later on in high school. So there's no reason for me to ever have to loop back and really get into Marvin Gaye until recently. And here's one of the reasons why this came up. I ran across an NPR interview with Terrence Blanchard that he was talking about music and protest in black music. And he specifically cited this album. He said that actually all black music is protest music, and that very often it's very easy to listen to the groove and the melody of black music, but not the words. And a lot of really well-intentioned people have like listened to music, listened to Marvin Gaye's music, and specifically listened to What's Going On, and sung along with it, and maybe even listened to the inflection of Marvin Gaye's performances and appreciated his performance, but not really listen to the words and not understand that what Marvin Gaye was getting at right there on this album in particular was that this is a protest album that's meant to talk about the perspective of a black man in the late 60s and early 70s about what was going on.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Picket lights, picket signs, punish me with brutality. Talk to me, honey, so you can see what's going on. What's going on? Hey, what's going on? Tell me what's going on. Woo!
So it's a very historically relevant album, very of the times. But if you listen to the album and you listen to the words and the message and what he's trying to say about black culture in the late 60s, it's virtually synonymous with what we're talking about today. What does he talk about in the album? Police brutality, concern for the children's future, the environment, living in poverty, stuff that even today, 50 years later, we're still not there on. We're still fighting these same issues. The message of what's going on is still resonating even to this day. What makes what's going on particularly interesting was that it's a 1971 album that came out of sort of the Motown hit factory. And Marvin Gaye was very adamant that he wanted to make an album that wasn't just a pop album, that wasn't just about, sexy tunes or whatever else. And the Motown hit factory kind of balked at that a little bit, but he pushed for it and actually ended up making a soul concept album. Probably one of the first people that ever did something like that. And its message is one that I think that's important that we can still get behind today. It's still worth listening to today. And the kind of soul background and the Motown feel of the album just kind of seems to deepen his sincerity of the messages that he's purveying on the album. And what he was trying to say at the time is what black culture is still saying today. Marvin Gaye's What's Going On. If you've never heard the album, check it out. If you have heard the album, sorry, I'm just catching up with you. All right. So that's my 6 albums for this particular roundup. Next week, I'll have another dedicated post for an album that I'm listening to. But until then, I'll catch you guys on the flip side.